Greetings, everybody. My name is James. I am from the internet. And today we are going to be talking about legalizing cannabis. Now, about a year ago, then Democratic nominee Joe Biden signaled in multiple speeches and appearances that he would support the will of the people, as well as the majority of the Democratic electorate, and pull back federal prohibitions on cannabis if he were elected president. Fast forward to today, and one appearance by VP Kamala Harris, where she sort of just laughed it off and said that the president had more important things to be dealing with, and that's why nothing had happened on the subject yet. He has been very quiet on the subject. However, it turns out that legalizing cannabis is back in the news anyway, on a federal stage. So today I want to take a look at what happened, and then I want to remind you all of just how important this would be if it were actually passed. Here we go. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas questions federal marijuana prohibition in IRS case. Now, for those who have been working on pushing deregulation or federal legislation on cannabis for decades, the fact that the executive branch has decided to go to sleep on this issue once again is leaving people with the only possible recourse or solution to this problem being a case getting kicked up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court somehow overturning or declaring the federal ban on cannabis to be unconstitutional. And so, surprise, surprise, a case actually made its way all the way up to the highest court of the land, even though technically it was an IRS case about taxation. Remember that part in the beginning where I told you that I would explain to you all of the many things that this sort of legislation or this sort of federal ban would touch upon? Taxation, yet another one of those issues, but I'll get to the list in a minute. One of the most conservative Supreme Court justices asserted Monday that federal prohibitions on marijuana, quote, may no longer be necessary if the government looks the other way amid widespread legalization of the drug in states. If the federal government is now content to allow states to act as laboratories and try novel social and economic experiments, then it might no longer have authority to intrude on states' core police powers, said Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Yes, Clarence Thomas, arguably the single most conservative member of the Supreme Court in the last 40 years. Yeah, that guy. And although it doesn't sound like he's exactly pushing for the legalization of cannabis because people should have the right to consume a plant that grows naturally in the wild, he is in fact discussing the balance between federal authority and states' rights, because Clarence Thomas also considers himself to be somewhat of a constitutionalist. And in recent years, he's leaned even further into state powers versus federal powers in many of his decisions. Quote, a prohibition on interstate use or cultivation of marijuana may no longer be necessary or proper to support the federal government's piecemeal approach, Thomas wrote in the court's decision to punt on a tax case involving a dispensary in Colorado. The medical dispensary is legal under Colorado law, but the U.S. tax code prohibits businesses that sell controlled substances prohibited by federal law from writing off certain expenses. When the IRS issued a summons to the Colorado Department of Revenue for information about the dispensary's deductions, they sued to stop the disclosure of those records. The Denver-based U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit ruled against the dispensary. The Supreme Court declined Monday to review that decision. Now, there is no silver bullet that comes from punting on this case. This won't somehow affect federal legislation or the federal determination to classify cannabis as a Schedule I narcotic on the same par with like cocaine and heroin and meth. Yeah, even downgrading it would help. However, what this statement does do is it sends out a message to other cases that might be making their way up through different appellate divisions that Clarence Thomas and other conservatives on the Supreme Court would be willing to rule in favor of states' rights regarding cannabis legalization and sales in a broader scale if such cases were brought before them. Now, while I would love to see that happen, as previously stated, the easier solution would be the executive or legislative branches stepping in and forcing the DEA to either reduce the scheduling of cannabis or to get rid of the federal ban altogether in much the same way that they did for alcohol back in the day. So let's check in on where our good friend President Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and the rest of the executive branch are currently hanging out on this specific topic that they have already told us would be a priority in order to secure our votes a year ago. Where you at on this, Joe? Let me know. Something is happening in the White House that also happens in the mass public. While the president supports some type of changes to the cannabis policy, the issue apparently lacks the salience to prioritize the issue thus far in his tenure. This mirrors complaints in some of the cannabis community about why greater progress has not been made on the issue, given the broad support in the public, nearly 70% in some polling. Yeah, for all of you who are really into democracy and the will of the people and having your voice heard, this one might be kind of a head scratcher. I mean, it's not like alcohol producers, national restaurant ownership groups, and a bunch of other industries aren't heavily lobbying members of the government to ensure that legalization never takes place, but yet somehow 70% of people are okay with legalizing cannabis, but nobody in the legislature or the executive branch seems to really hear those voices. Apparently, the other 30%, plus all the people paying them in lobbying donations, are louder than the other 70% of people who are kind of sick of seeing a plant being criminalized and used as an excuse to lock up tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and yes, even millions of people. Many Americans do not see the issue as a priority or hold the position with such deep passion that it moves a significant number of U.S. senators to make change happen. For advocates to succeed at any level, among voters and among elected officials, all the way up to the president, they must convince them of the importance of the issue. Start paying attention here, people, because this is where you come in. One way to convince the president of the issue is to connect it to specific issues the president cares about. Demonstrating the opportunities that cannabis legalization can create to fund mental health and addiction services is helpful for anyone with a child who's experienced a substance use disorder. Go ahead, Republicans, snicker, make your Hunter Biden jokes. They're more than applicable. Go ahead, enjoy yourselves. Amplifying the importance of cannabis reform for communities of color and issues of justice and opportunity is particularly powerful to a president whose election hinged on support and turnout from communities of color, the same communities that the Democratic Party is going to once again have to squeeze very hard to get to come out and vote in the midterms in 2022, which have a historically low turnout, and then again for the presidency in 2024, regardless of whether it's Biden, Harris, or somebody else who ends up picking up the mantle. A Biden embrace of cannabis reform could also put him in the driver's seat to shape the law more closely to his liking. If Biden believes others in the party may prefer an overly permissive system of regulation, he could use his position to rein that in. Yeah, that would be a shocker. Cannabis legalization finally happening, and then on the cusp of everything being signed and going forwards, Biden turning around and saying, I would veto this unless you pull that back some, because, we don't need everybody being a hippie all doped up on the devil's lettuce. As president, particularly if cannabis reform is achieved via executive branch processes, he could play a powerful hand in setting the precise role of the federal government in this space, at the same time as a reflection of his own views and his meaningful outreach to the demographic groups who lifted him to office. He can push his administration to use cannabis reform to address a variety of issues of racial justice. That latter effort will also serve as an olive branch to a group of progressive legislators, interest groups, and voters who may grow skeptical of the president's willingness or ability to advance their interests. And this is the part of the show where I remind you that sans legislation, the executive branch still has the ability to call upon the DEA to declassify or lower the classification of cannabis, regardless of what the House and the Senate could possibly come up with. At any time, Biden could just set forth a directive to the DEA and make cannabis a Schedule 2, a Schedule 3, or even a declassified narcotic if he chose to. Obviously, he's not going to go that route because it's seemingly not all that important to him. However, if it's important to you, you have a way to put pressure on the people who can make it happen. So how can you, the average viewer, who I am 100% convinced would totally never ever consume illegal cannabis, how could all of y'all who would love to consume legalized cannabis but totally wouldn't break the law, what can you do to make this happen? Well, there were a bunch of good suggestions in there. And yes, cannabis reform goes over and overlaps a number of different subjects, which are, to some people, the single most important issue in a legislative session. There are criminal justice issues. There are racial balance issues. There are tax issues, finance issues, not to mention the licensing and sale. Cannabis is literally an issue for almost any legislator in any district because it touches upon something. What? Your district doesn't have enough money for schools? Well, Colorado's making like $1 billion a year on their state cannabis tax. That's all going to fund their education. In fact, they had so much money for education, they then took some of the extra money out and put it towards even other community issues. So yes, I keep hearing towns and communities and states are running cash negative and they're strapped for cash. Well, here's your easy answer. So time to get on the horse, people. This is one of those times where you can create a massive amount of change without having to go and block freeways and risk getting tear gassed by cops. So everybody, kick back, relax, and also digitally organize, because you totally have the power to make this happen. Until next time, my name is James, I am from the internet, and I am out. Peace.